seat, please. The clerk will swear you.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat, please, sir. And to clarify the record, this is a proffer. The jury is not present.
Dr. McElfresh, I'm not going to go into all your credentials again. I don't think the courts are well aware of what your credentials were. But I'm talking about, at this point, after performing your DNA analysis, did you do a calculation to determine the likelihood of obtaining a similar DNA match?
I did.
Okay. What specific training experience allows you to do that?
Well, it started with undergraduate school and then graduate school, where these calculations are routinely used for lots of different applications other than forensics. Following that, then after my doctoral work in population genetics, working in forensic analysis, beginning all the way back in the 1980s, likelihood ratios were part of what we considered when we did analysis then. And then in 1996, the National Research Council put forth their guidelines and suggested that likelihood ratio and the multiplication rule were the appropriate way to do the kind of analysis that I did. I have taught graduate classes that use the likelihood ratio. I've attended seminars and other things where other people have talked about the likelihood ratio, and I've taught workshops on a national level about how to analyze samples and then set up likelihood ratio calculations based on that analysis.
Okay. And it sounds like you've maintained that kind of education, continuing education, keep updated with this kind of stuff.
Yes, certainly, and I continue to this day to work on various, developing things like, computer programs to help analyze these things, and it requires an awful lot of study to make sure you're up on all of those things.
Okay. And based upon that, have you ever been able to give your opinion regarding statistical frequencies in a court of law?
Yes, sir, I have.
Approximately how many times?
I think the first time I gave my opinion on statistics in a court of law was 1987, and I've used the same calculations, and I gave my opinion just a few weeks ago. So continually for the last 32 years, it's a lot. I must admit I've lost count.
Okay, that's fine. Is there a specific methodology, and I think you just talked about this, is there a specific methodology that you utilize to do your statistical analysis?
Yes, it's called the likelihood ratio, and it's a very standard calculation. It allows you to ask two questions and compare the probability of one or the other question being more likely. And we do something like that all the time, right? We get up in the morning, we look out the window, is it more likely to rain or more likely to be a sunny day? And we take the data that we have from being cloudy or clear sky or whatever, and we combine that information and we do a probability. We basically say it's more likely. Today when I landed in Tallahassee, it was gray and cloudy. That's indicative of rainy weather. So what the likelihood ratio is, the formal math behind that. You can say, is this collection of data more likely if I explain it this way, or is this collection of data more likely if I explain it a different way? And you do that calculation and you get an answer that says this explanation or the other is more likely. And then you do that multiple times for each locus that you have data for in this case, and you multiply them together. But this has been the standard of practice since the 1980s. The likelihood ratio is something that's been used in mathematics and medical testing and science for decades and decades before that.
Okay. And does that methodology utilize a specific database, or did you utilize a specific database to determine the calculations correctly?
I did. We have to decide how to evaluate the data collection that we have. That is it common or less common? And we do that. The database that we use now is maintained by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is the old Bureau of Standards. And they maintain the standardized database that everybody in the country uses. It's published online, it's published in peer-reviewed journals, and made available to the scientific community, but maintained by the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Okay. Are you familiar with that database and how it was obtained?
Yes, I am.
Can you please explain that?
Sure. Basically, it is a collection of individuals, approximately 1,036 individuals, and they're divided up into 300 or so, 340 to 280 to 340 between African American, Caucasian, Hispanic, and also some Asian population. And you simply run their DNA against the current kits, and you collect that data and you create frequencies of occurrence, just as if you had a bucket of marbles and you pulled out the individual marbles, counted all the whites and the reds and the blues and the blacks, totaled them up and did the percentage. But back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we did a lot of database building in this country for various police agencies, and it all is very similar.
Okay. And is that same calculations you just talked about and that database you just talked about what you utilize in making your calculations as it relates to this particular analysis?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about that analysis. The analysis that you made and the calculations you made, are you making the calculation based upon Henry Segura being included, or is it based upon the group of individuals that is included in that sample being included, as opposed to the rest of the population?
It's the group of individuals. So basically, when you interpret the data, you look at the raw data first, then you take the data from reference samples, and you say which person or group of persons best explains the data that I see. And then based on that explanation, is it more likely that that group of individuals explains the data or an unknown group of individuals that explains the data? And Henry Segura and the children and Brandy Peters were the group that best explained that data.
How would that be affected by a database based upon unrelated individuals?
Well, the database that it actually is, that we use, is unrelated individuals. But what we're asking the question here is, does this group of individuals explain the data, or does an unknown group explain the data? We're not asking about relationship at this point, because in the situation where the people that explain the data are being tested, that probability is 1. They explain all the data. So the question then becomes, what do unknown individuals have that might explain the data, and what's more likely? So this isn't a question about relationship at all. This is a question about explaining the data. If we wanted to ask the relationship question, that would be a different question and a different calculation.
So you're really not worried, when you're doing this calculation, you're not talking about the relationship between the group of persons that you're talking about there is irrelevant, essentially, when you're doing the database calculation, because you're talking, those are going to be unrelated persons, correct?
Correct.
Frequency outside of that group is what you're looking at.
That is correct.
Okay. No further questions, sir?
Well, let's hear what his opinion is going to be.
All right. And what was your calculation and opinion regarding frequency?
The probability is that it's 700 billion times more likely that the data is explained by Brandy Peters, the children, and Henry Segura, rather than 3 untested individuals.
You keep saying 3 untested individuals, and you keep saying children. There are 3 children involved here, Tamai and Tanai, who are twins, so we would expect them to be the same, correct?
Correct, that's what I meant. The twins, Brandy Peters and Henry Segura.
Okay. Then that brings another question. Did you exclude Javante Segura from that calculation?
I did. There are a couple of instances where his DNA doesn't explain, it doesn't fit in the pattern that we saw.
Yeah, and then talking about the pattern of the analysis, not what you're trying, not the calculation you're
That's
doing.
correct.
Okay. And we'll get into that a lot more. So you're really talking about, when you're talking about the group of 3 individuals, you're talking about Henry Segura, Javante Tanaya, because they are effectively, for your analysis, 1 person.
Correct.
And then Brandy Peters.
Correct.
Okay. And that would be what your opinion is based on, your calculation is based upon.
That's correct.
Okay. No further questions.
Cross.
Dr. McElfresh, you indicated you excluded Javante from your calculations. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Are you saying that he's excluded as a potential contributor to this mixture?
It's difficult to say, but there are instances where Henry Segura explains the missing data that the children and Brandy don't have, and Javante doesn't explain. So it would appear that he's excluded, and so I used the three individuals, Henry and the twins and Brandy.
Okay. So I guess let me break this down into a few different questions. First of all, there's only two foreign allele. That is, allele that are foreign to Brandy, Javante, and the twins. Is that correct?
Yes, let me pull my file here so that I don't have to do that from memory.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Ask your question again, please,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Prince.
And I'll direct you to specifically what I'm looking at. The only two allele, if we're going to call them allele, in this mixture that are foreign to Brandy Peters, the twins, and Javante are the 14 at D5 and the 16 at D8. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And those are both low RFU or starred allele, correct?
Well, yes, there's a lot. This is a very low-level mixture. It's complex. It makes interpretation difficult. That's certainly true.
And this is, because it's a low volume sample, we have dropout throughout. Is that correct?
There are instances of dropout, yes.
Okay. Down at D5, was that 9 there, one of the peaks that you called as an allele?
I did not call it because of its overall morphology as a peak.
Mm-hmm.
And they had it starred and removed for that very reason.
Right. Javante, one of Javante's allele numbers at D5 would have been the 9 though, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So if we're acknowledging that this is a low volume sample with dropout prevalent throughout, can't we say that it's possible that Javante is still contributing at some allele, at some loci and not at others, or at least that we're not able to see his DNA at other loci?
I think the issue is that in the instance like here, you have a much larger picture to consider, right? And that is that at D5, you have, for what is intents and purposes here, a prominent 7 and 11, which the twins and Brandy have. Brandy has an 11-11, the twins have a 7-11, and that leaves the two peaks at 12 and 14 to be explained. And Henry has the 12 and 14. Javante doesn't have a 12, and the 12 is clearly there. So that leaves him out as one of the people who explains the data, right? 9 or not, he doesn't have the 12. So, we're having, what you have to do at that point is you have to start backtracking and making exceptions. Whereas if you use the three individuals that I did, you don't have to make any exceptions at all. It all fits the data quite nicely. And further, Henry, being a 12 and 14, has exactly those two alleles that are low level and different from Brandy and the twins. So that's one of those issues where you have to be careful not to sort of cherry pick what you're looking at, but look at more of the holistic explanation.
Okay, so if we're looking at D5, for example, where Javante is a 7-9, correct?
At D5.
Right.
Let me just check. You're talking about Javante Segura?
Yes.
At D5.
Oh, I'm sorry. He's a 11-14.
He's an 11-14, that's correct.
Okay. So that starred allele there that you were using at D5, Javante's a 14 there as well, correct?
Well, he's a 14, but he's not a 12.
Okay, so it's the 12 and the 16 that are foreign, not the 14 and the 16. I think I asked that wrong before.
Okay, my explanation is the same. It's the same explanation I just gave you a moment ago because the interpretation stays the same. Henry has the 12 and 14 that stand apart. Javante has the 11, 14, but not the 12. Mm-hmm. So we have to start creating exceptions at that point.
What do you mean when you say creating exceptions?
Well, you have to start invoking explanations of either dropout or low level or other things, whereas with the three individuals that we look at, we don't have to do any of that. They're all there.
Well, you say we have to start invoking dropout, but you've already acknowledged dropout is prevalent throughout the sample. Is that right?
Again, yes, that's true. But in this particular instance, what we're looking for when you're working with low-level samples, especially because they're more difficult than samples where you have tons of DNA, you have to begin looking for places where you can identify, for example, individuals that have a particular genotype that only they have represented in that sample that's different from others. And that's what we have here.
The point I'm really trying to get to, though, is that if Javante is contributing to this mixture, and you're using frequency of occurrence tables that take into account how often we would expect to see a particular genetic profile in a given population set of unrelated individuals, numbers that you're attributing to Mr. Segura could be showing up because of Javante. Do you disagree with that?
Yes.
And why do you disagree with that?
Because your explanation wound around a couple of things that just aren't true. First of all, I'm not trying to explain just Mr. Segura here. I'm explaining all three individuals together as a group. So I'm not trying to explain one person in the group, but rather the group together, because they explain the data together. So this takes into account all of those people together. I'm not trying to use any one specific individual's genotype as the frequency of occurrence, but rather all the alleles that we see together in the group to explain the probability. This is a probability of the group, not the individual.
And how would it impact your calculations as to the frequency of occurrence for Mr. Segura or for the group as a whole if Javante is contributing?
Well, the numbers would be incredibly low because we would have places where he doesn't exist. So, D8's another example where his marker's missing. So we wouldn't be able to use that. So it would make the data much harder to explain, and therefore the probability would be very low.
Right, and we already know that even Mr. Segura, for example, according to you, isn't showing up at every allele, at every locus. Isn't that correct?
Everybody from Brandy Peters and the twins and other people aren't showing up at every allele. This is a very low-level mixture, so that's true for everybody.
And that's kind of my point, that there's prevalent dropout, and if Javante is contributing, that would completely skew the statistics.
It would make the statistics lower. So and that's the advantage here. What we've done, and by we, I guess I mean me, the fact of the matter is, what I did was go through this, generate the best explanation for the data, and use the data that was complete enough to come up with an explanation to generate the statistics. If I were to use Javante, then that group of data that's usable would be so much lower that the statistics would be meaningless. And that's exactly what we're trying to come to an answer on here is what's the best explanation of that data and what's the statistic for it. If you want to invoke other explanations, you can do that and you can recalculate, but the number is going to be low.
And so I guess this is my problem. You keep saying that we have to invoke another explanation or invoke an exception, but we're not invoking dropout. We know dropout is present. You've testified to that yourself.
Right. I have, and dropout exists, but you're invoking dropout as an exception in certain places to explain data that already exists, and that's the problem. I'm using data that exists. Where I see dropout, I'm not using that data against anybody, not against Henry Segura, not against Javante or Brandy or the twins. That data is set aside as being consistent but not complete. Where I have complete data, I can eliminate Javante as part of the explanation being the most likely. So you can't just say, well, because I see dropout, therefore I can use it to my advantage wherever I want.
Isn't that what you did, though, for example, at D3? We have only 2 peaks there, of 15, 17, at virtually identical RFU values, 245 and 246, which would, as a general matter, you would agree, indicate only one contributor showing up there. Is that true?
Not necessarily, no.
Well,
if you look at the data, right, you have a much lower likelihood ratio for 3 individuals being contributors of 15 and 17. If you look at the frequency of those alleles in the population, it's like saying, well, I've got 3 people together here and all 3 of them have brown eyes. That's hardly a surprising occurrence. I'm sure we can find a lot more than 3 people in this courtroom with brown eyes. And that's the situation you're talking about. In a mixture, I've seen mixtures of 3 individuals with only 1 peak. And that's because of the frequency of occurrence of that particular allele being very common, again, like brown eyes.
I'm not so concerned about the frequency of occurrence. My point there is that the peak proportions would generally indicate that there's only a single donor showing up there. Isn't that generally true?
No, not in this situation. You're pulling one locus away and saying, well, this only means this. And you're trying to interpret without the rest of the data. And the importance in all of this is one of the basic things I teach is that you have to look at all of the data and come up to a conclusion that explains the data and explains what you're looking at, and then go back, determine which data is complete enough to use as calculation, use that data and make sure that the rest is you can develop explanations for. And if you look at D3, so at D3, the 3, Brandy Peters is 1517, the twins are 1517, and Mr. Segura is 1717. And we know he's a minor part of that mixture. That all makes perfect sense. All those 3 individuals between them only have 15 and 17, and that's what we see in the data.
But the values themselves don't give you indication that either the twins or Mr. Segura is showing up there. Isn't that true?
Again, you have to use all of the interpretation, right? That's a completely consistent explanation for the data based on what they have.
So you're saying that because you expect to find Mr. Segura, because you're looking at the 12 and the 16, you're going to find him present, or at least do calculations to include him as present at a locus, which in a vacuum wouldn't indicate contribution by him or any other person.
Well, you said it yourself, in a vacuum. That's not the way you get to do this. That leads to problems. And so once I've determined by looking at the electropherogram, as we've just done, that there's only a 15 and a 17 there, and it's a low molecular weight locus because it's on the left, then the question is, when I begin to look at the group of people that could be contributors, 15s and 17s are the only ones that get to play.
What do you mean by that?
Well, somebody who's a 19 and a 20 is somebody who's going to be eliminated or possibly excluded, but I'm going to have to find a reason. I have to begin invoking exceptions, as I talked about earlier.
As a general matter, would you agree that if you know a parent and child are both included in a mixture, it would make doing statistics very, very difficult perhaps impossible, and lower them to the point that they may not even be probative.
No, I wouldn't agree.
So what were you talking about before when you said if we knew Javante was included, that would basically take a wrecking ball to your statistics?
If we knew he was included and we have loci where we don't have data for him that we otherwise used in our calculation, we would have to invoke an explanation that removed that locus entirely from the calculation, which would drop the calculation by a multiplication value of 200 in one instance, and I can tell you, just a moment. It would drop the calculation by a multiplication value of almost 1,200 and a multiplication value of 600, right? So now, now instead of 700 billion, we're going to have a number in the hundreds or the thousands. And that's what I was talking about, not relationship.
I understand. No further questions.
Any redirect?
They are.
I hear you, Mr. Prince, it's your objection.
I'm sorry?
You wish to be heard on your objection to his testimony?
Yes, Your Honor. I also have Mr. Bundy standing by to testify telephonically.
Okay. So, we'll let the witness step down then.
What's that? How do we logistically need to handle getting Mr. Bundy? I have his number here to call. We're going to do that.
I'll go down here. Thanks a little pre-planning, Mr. Prince. You haven't made any arrangements at all to get him on the phone?
I have. I spoke to him and let him know that we'd be calling him.
I mean, in the court.
I can go again.
Do we have a speakerphone in here? What? Okay, put it up here. We'll do the best we can, but a little forethought would help, Mr. Prince. We have better phones that we could have brought in here. So then just need to turn around. I'm having my right. Good. Why don't you come dialing? Get him out and have her line.
Here, Dr. McElfresh, you.
Okay.
Eddie's gonna go eat lunch.
Okay. Where do you want me?
Just a second. See.
Mr. Bundy, good afternoon. This is Nick Prince up here in Tallahassee regarding the Henry Segura case, which you previously testified in. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
And you're on speakerphone in open court here.
I guess I've seen him before, so. Raise your right hand, solemnly swear your testimony about presented to be the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do.
All right. State your name for the record.
My name is Jason Bundy.
Go ahead, Mr. Prince.
Mr. Bundy, regarding the interpretation of FDLE Exhibit 126, PB 116, States Exhibit 63, swallowed the back part. Do you have the electropharogram and the information relative to that evidentiary exhibit accessible to you and available?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I first want to ask you some general questions about doing statistics or statistical inclusion in a data set where related persons are contributors. Can you tell me if that's problematic, and if so, why?
Okay, so when it comes to creating a statistic, you have to designate what restrictions may be based on assumptions to make the math work appropriately. So the type of statistics that are generally used in forensics, such as the random match probability or combined probability of inclusion, would give you a result that
So the frequency of occurrence tables that are used by FDLE in compliance with their interpretive guidelines, those are based on frequency of occurrence amongst unrelated individuals. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And when a data set contains individuals that are related, do FDLE interpretive guidelines permit you to do inclusion statistics for those individuals?
If we're aware that they're related individuals, we take that into account, but we always report that the statistic that we're reporting is based on unrelated individuals. So it really, again, like a lot of situations, it would depend on the information that we have available. Many times we may not know, but if we do, we would try not to report a statistic with related individuals.
Okay, and if you are reporting frequency of occurrence or likelihood ratio in a data set with individuals known to be related, how is that going to impact your statistical report? Maybe that question's not clear. If with known individuals, you're using frequency of occurrence ratios for unrelated individuals, how is it going to skew your findings or your statistics, if at all?
I'm not sure if I understood your question, but let me ask this. Are you saying
Let him ask another question.
more related to the statistic?
The judge was just indicating that I should re-ask.
That's the problem with this phone, when somebody's talking, they can't hear you, so. But anyway, ask a little clearer question, please, Mr. Brent.
Yes, sir. Basically what I'm trying to figure out is if you have contribution to a data set by related individuals and you use your frequency of occurrence statistics for unrelated individuals, are your results, your reported statistics going to be skewed?
They are not as accurate as they could be. So yes, they are skewed. The difference would be that if a resulting statistic, for instance, was 1 in 10 million for unrelated individuals, the actual statistical relationship, if we could calculate it for when we know that they are potentially related individuals in the data set, would be much more common. So it would be, I don't know if I could really guess, but it would be, maybe more on the tenfold lower, 1 to a million or 1 to even 500,000 range.
And on top of the complications added in doing statistics by the presence of multiple related individuals, how is that problem compounded when you have a data set with prevalent dropout throughout?
That's actually a very good question. That's the biggest concern is that when you have a complete profile, you have all the loci that we're looking at and all the data readily available, we can identify an individual because we know, based on lots and lots of research, that no two people should have the same DNA profile, complete DNA profile, except identical twins. But when you have partial information, we absolutely know and expect, especially people that are related, that they share a certain amount of the same DNA. And this is the basis of all genetic genealogy and how people create family trees genetically. Because they know that they have shared information passed on from one generation to the next. So the closer you are in a familiar relationship, the more likely you have similar DNA profiles.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Fuchs, if you want a question, you have to come up here.
Give me 1 second, please.
Okay.
Mr. Bundy, the calculations you just talked about is based upon doing a calculation of a single individual included within a result of DNA in that frequency, correct?
I'm sorry, can you just reiterate that one more time for me?
Yeah, the calculations that Mr. Prince was just asking about was based upon doing a calculation of a single individual as contained in a DNA profile as opposed to frequency of occurrence in the rest of the world, correct?
Yes, you're making a comparison as far as what are the expectations of the probability for this person versus a random individual.
Correct. All right, but you're not talking about the frequency of occurrence of a group of individuals. A frequency of occurrence as a group can be done. So for instance, in this particular case, we have 3 individuals for argument purposes. You have Brandy, Tamaya Tanaya, and Henry Segura. A calculation can be done as far as that group of individuals against the rest of the world, though, can it?
The statistic that we'd be able to do, I think you're referring to, is a mixed profile inclusion statistic, and that statistic would be specific to can one individual be included in a mixed set of information. So even if there's donors for 3 or 4 people in the mixture, I would potentially be able to produce a statistic that would say the probability of one person being in that mixture versus the random person.
Okay, can you do a probability of the mixture as an entirety, as opposed to the rest of a statistical calculation of that group of individuals, as opposed to everybody else?
The only statistic that comes to mind that you would have to make assumptions to who would be in there. So, for instance, if I wanted to do a statistic called the likelihood ratio, I can make assumptions that multiple people are in that, or that requires these 3 people versus all random individuals.
Okay. And that
ratio that you can do that.
so the likelihood calculation can be done in that circumstance, correct?
It can be postulated that way, yeah.
Okay. And going back to what Mr. Prince was talking to you about, if Javante is, and I think we even covered this actually when you were up here last week, if Javante is in fact excluded out of that sample, then really the aspect of them being unrelated or related is moot, because at that point Henry Segura is not related to the twins nor Brandy Peters as far as genetically, correct?
Genetically, that is, well, outside of the mother, Henry Segura is not related to the mother or the 2 other children, if that's what you're asking.
Correct. So therefore a statistic based upon unrelated individuals is entirely proper.
If no relationships are included, yes.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true for 126 based on the reports that we have.
I understand that, but I mean, you would agree that that's entirely proper if that was the case.
Correct.
All right, no further questions.
Further, Mr. Prince?
Yes, sir. Mr. Bundy, if it is not the case that Javante is excluded, which is to say that if Javante is included, talk more about the assumptions you're making by trying to do inclusion to the mixture for Mr. Segura, where his son's DNA is known to be present.
So, because the relationship that we're looking at here for related individuals is a parent to a child, that the expectation is that half of all the child's DNA came from that father. So, it's absolutely expected, and so there is no statistic that would be really supportive of identifying who gave that half of the DNA, the child or the father. So, anything that the child has in here, it's not easily determined what would come from the father versus what would come from the son. So the only way that you can really look and see what statistically would be significant to Henry Segura would be to see anything that the related child does not have.
Okay.
Either half, so to speak.
And again, you indicated before, if I understood you correctly, that prevalent dropout impacts that even further. Is that correct?
True, when it comes to creating statistics in general, we don't have much information. We generally do not use statistics due to it becomes inconclusive that too many people could have donated that information.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
All right.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bundy. We're hanging up.
Further testimony, Mr. Prince?
No, Your Honor.
You can be heard.
Your Honor, the finding by FBLE was that Javante is included in the mixture. And with Javante being included in the mixture, we already detailed a variety of reasons why the mixture should be deemed interpretable in the first place. The problem that we have here is that he's doing statistics based on inclusion to a mixture in instances where there is no evidence of contribution by Mr. Segura or anybody else. The only potential allele that are foreign to the 4 victims here are at locus D5 and locus D8. Both of those are starred alleles, which is already a problematic situation and violative of the interpretive guidelines that FDLE follows. And again, these are not just suggestions for overly cautious preventative measures. As we discussed Friday, the process of validating results from instruments in a particular lab is required at each lab, and anybody interpreting data out of that lab is supposed to comply with those guidelines. I understand the court's ruled that Mr. McElfresh is going to be permitted to say that Mr. Segura is included, but to then report statistically where there's only 2 even potential foreign allele to the victim, and to use data sets that don't indicate he or anyone else being present just compounds the error of doing the interpretation in the first place. And I would say, based on the combined evidence from the various FDLE and private experts here, that Dr. McElfresh's interpretation is not consistent with scientific norms and should be prevented.
Right, I'm gonna overrule the objection. Really, it's a renewed attack on my prior ruling, not really a statistical issue. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I guess if there's a conviction, the District Court of Appeal or Supreme Court will get to decide that. But the real issue is not the statistics. It's that Dr. McElfresh has excluded Javante from the mixture. That opinion can be attacked. That really goes back to the initial ruling. It's not about the statistics. His statistics are accepted. Even Mr. Bundy accepted the statistics. I understand your argument that what he has done is not what FDLE has done. I don't think it causes confusion among the jury to say that if his son is included in the mixture, the probabilities are much less and probably not statistically significant. The jury can understand that. That's not confusing, but what this witness is saying is that the son is not included and has developed statistics based upon that. So I'm going to overrule the objection. Anything else we need to resolve on this?
No, Your Honor.
No, not from the defense.
Are we going to? So what we're going to do next, Mr. Pugh?
No, actually, Your Honor, we're going to go to Mrs. Jeffrey Foggy, then we're going to do Ms. Brown, who obviously did all the analysis, and then we'll move into Dr. McElfresh.
Well, better make sure we don't run out of time today.
I plan on it, Your Honor. That's been a debate we've had.
We've got, you need to consider the length of cross-examination, because if we run out of time, it's going to be Tuesday, and he's going to have to be back here.
Okay.
All right. All right, we'll be in recess till 1 o'clock.